Okay, this is a video by Top Lists. It's called 10 Mind-Blowing Things You Didn't Know About the Civil War. So let's see if we know them or if we don't. This is real time. We don't cut and paste or go through an editor. So if I don't know it, I don't know it. But tell me in the comments below whether you knew this or not. And don't forget to comment respectfully. Hit the like button if you think this is interesting. Share it out, and if you get a chance, if you do like it, I'd appreciate if you'd subscribe. So let's get moving. And 10 mind-blowing things you didn't know about the Civil War, or did you?
While the American Civil War only lasted a mere 4 years, resulting in a victory for the North, the death toll was staggering. Over 600,000 people died on the battlefield, and more perished from disease and illness. To this day, historians have argued about what truly sparked this conflict, such as, was there more to it than just slavery? During this time, some truly remarkable and shocking events took place, from wounds glowing in the dark to armies collecting urine for the war effort. I'm Jake the Voice Par, and these are 10 things you probably didn't know about the American Civil War.
Alright, already I'm kind of stoked. I think this is interesting because already there are some topics that came up that I'm like, ooh, I don't know about that. Alright, let's check it out.
Some people these days believe Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, was a hero for his time because of his anti-slavery stance. This is not entirely true. Lincoln denied being an abolitionist and believed black slaves to be racially inferior. During the great debates of 1850,
You know what? It's actually true. I would say most of the world was racist at that point, going both ways, even African towards European, Caucasian, whatever you want to say. It was like this, and Lincoln was really no different. Up to and when he became president, he would have been considered, like a supremacist, I guess, is the way to put it, or like a just flat out racist. There is also there are a lot of things you have to look at, like context of the time, but let's see what they say.
58, slavery was discussed. Lincoln said, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the whites and black races, and that the white man is to have the superior position." It's possible that he said these things for the sake of political expediency, but still, what a nasty man.
It's important to note, though, that one of the great redeeming qualities of Abraham Lincoln was his ability to change his stance. And though he's celebrated by many people in the United States and around the world as a champion of civil rights and a lot of things, he did believe that slavery was, it was a thing. And I think he said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And people would say flip-flopper. On the other hand, in his time, his views evolved. And when it came to the end of the war, his views changed radically due to people like Frederick Douglass, the colored regiments that were raised, so many different things, so that's one of the great things I think about Abraham Lincoln. He was able to evolve in his thinking. Some people wouldn't agree. They would say maybe he was an extreme comment I saw was that he was 100% brainwashed by people who had his ear. Somewhere in between evolution of thinking and brainwashing, that's Lincoln for you.
The first deaths in the American Civil War were accidents. The Confederates fired over 4,000 shells at Fort Sumter. The Union forces decided to surrender and saluted by firing 50 of their cannons. Unfortunately, during the ceremony, 2 Union soldiers blew themselves up. As for the men in grey, during the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, the troops decided to fire their weapons into the dead of night. Due to poor visibility, they ended up killing General Jackson, their ally. A bit of caution would have been helpful.
I want to just mention another thing. At the beginning of the war, both sides wore blue. And there were other things like Zouave troops who were they were taking after the French military at the time, and just before. They were all dressed differently. It's not like the South said we're seceding and the color of our uniform is gray or brown. They had what they had to fight with, and a lot of times they fought and they were fighting the wrong. Manassas is a great example. They were unsure. I'm not quite recalling who the general was that marched his regiment or his brigade up onto another brigade, thinking it was his own, or not his own, his own country. His own for the North, and it turned out that they were from the South, and not a lot of good came out of that. But they were absolutely, in the dark of night, you can't see the difference, especially, let's just say you both speak English, you both have the same tactics, everyone looks the same, both sides wore kepis, the uniforms are very, very similar. The blue definitely stuck out more, and as the war went on, sometimes they were just covered in blood. A lot of times they were covered in dirt and mud. And that's the fog of war that happened. So that's an interesting point that he brings up. Real good point.
If you were injured on the battlefield, you were in for a world of hurt. Gunshot wounds were prone to gangrene infections. The only known cure was to cut off any infected limbs as quickly as possible. The top brass could do it in half a minute. Some doctors jabbed their fingers into gunshot wounds and pushed lodged bullets out of any nearby exits, then felt for any broken bones. Most had little to no experience or training. Anesthetic was not mandatory, though there were times when patients died via overdose. Strangely enough, roughly 3 in 4 soldiers survived the gruesome and painful amputation procedure, which was a notably higher rate than civilians. Only half of them survived.
Yeah, that's actually it's quite true. When it came to medicine, there wasn't a whole lot in terms of evolution. During the Crimean War, was it Florence Nightingale, I believe, helped make conditions more sanitary, which cut down on disease. But poking a finger into somebody's wound wasn't really seen as the idea of germs and infection wasn't seen wasn't thought of when it was on your hand, like wearing a glove, making it sterile. When you feel around for a bullet, these bullets didn't go right through you the way a lot of them do today. They hit your bone and they shattered it. There was really not a whole lot they could do in terms of putting a cast on something. They got the bullet out, and if they didn't, and it, then they just cut your leg off. Plus, you have to think of it like, it was like a buffet. Maybe that's a bad example, but it was like an assembly line. Bring the next one in, cut the leg off. Bring the next one in, cut the leg off. And that was just it. That's the way war was. So when you're talking 600,000 casualties, I forget, it was like a third of them were death and wounds. You got to imagine how, and they're all happening at one time, like right after a major battle, just boom, 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 legs come off, that kind of thing. And they weren't even, the surgeons a lot of times didn't even have any kind of medical training. As long as you could saw off a leg and move on, you were good. Then you just kind of washed the blood off your hands in a bowl of bloody water, and you moved on. I know it sounds horribly gruesome, but it's just the way it was.
One of the ingredients for gunpowder is nitrate. It was discovered that urine contained this chemical, yet collecting large quantities proved difficult. Initially, the Confederates ended up trying to collect lumps of urine-soaked earth from barns and smokehouses. Mining officer John Harrelson of Selma, Alabama, published an advert in a newspaper requesting the women of the town to save their chamber pots so that their tinkle can be collected in a barrel for the war effort. Army poets got creative and decided to write poems to the tune of Maryland, My Maryland. Confederate poets shunned the idea. An unknown figure wrote a few additional tongue-in-cheek verses dubbed the Yankee view of it, which protested that there was found in this compound one serious objection. No soldier boy could sniff it without having an erection. Even during wartime, soldiers still had a sense of humor, a naughty one at that.
I'd say so. I have to admit, I have vaguely heard about that, like years and years ago, like when I was in college. I majored in history. Well, how to be a historian. That was my major, so it was history. But I vaguely remember hearing about this, but that's pretty darn disgusting. I guess it kind of makes sense in a weird way, but I don't think it was. Maybe somebody could tell me more on that topic. I just don't think it was very prevalent, and I don't think it was. I don't think it was truly enacted on any scale by any great means. But tell me if I'm wrong, please.
General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was a bit of a celebrity during his time. Before he joined the Confederate Army, he was beloved by black slaves for his firm but friendly attitude toward them. He stood his ground like a stone wall as he called in reinforcements during the hectic First Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861.
I believe it was General B that coined the phrase Stonewall Jackson. He said, "There stands Jackson," I think he said, "and his Virginians, like a stone wall." It was a rallying cry.
Hence the nickname. In 1863, a large-scale battle took place. Stonewall was accidentally shot by his allies, and he was sent to the hospital. While everyone else's limbs were tossed into a pile outside, Jackson's left arm was buried in its own personal grave outside of Elwood Manor, Virginia. Stonewall died of pneumonia a week later, but was buried in Lexington, about 500 miles away from his amputated limb. A year later, Union soldiers recovered the arm and reburied it in a location that remains unknown to this day. Still, the grave remains intact, and its tombstone is engraved with the simple message, "Arm of Stonewall Jackson."
I think it's interesting that you can still see that today. I thought they knew the location of his arm, but I could be wrong. But there are a couple cases of that, just like General Dan Sickles from Gettysburg. He had his leg blown off. He wanted it saved, and he would bring it to reunions. And then when he died, I believe it ended up in the Smithsonian, I think. But he was a very eccentric person. He was probably one of the most interesting personalities of the Civil War. But yeah, you can go see it, I think, in the Smithsonian, if I'm not mistaken, today. So there's a closeness to people and their limbs, you know?
Stonewall was an odd one. He loved to walk around raising his finger to the sky since he thought one of his arms and legs were bigger and heavier than the other. So, by raising his finger, he would balance his blood flow, thus alleviating said limbs. Funnily enough, during the First Battle of Bull Run, it is said that while he was raising his finger on horseback, it was hit by shrapnel. Doctors wanted to amputate the finger, but Stonewall turned down the offer. Thankfully, it healed without infection. Perhaps the enemy saw Jackson's finger and thought he was gloating like, "I bet you Yankees can't hit my finger from all the way over there."
I don't think Jackson was much of a gloater. He was quite a religious man. Didn't want to fight on like a Sunday, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, he believed it promoted good blood flow, if I recall correctly from one of the earliest books I read on him. Yeah, so a lot of times you'd find him with his hand up quite high above his head to promote blood flow. And he also sucked on lemons a lot too. He was an odd person, but nonetheless, he fit well with General Lee.
The Battle of the Crater was arguably the most embarrassing event to have taken place during the American Civil War. On paper, the plan sounded devious enough. Dig a mine underneath the Confederates, detonate some explosives, and blast them to kingdom come. The blast killed 200 enemies and left a massive crater, but the Union soldiers foolishly climbed inside of it. The Confederates arrived and picked them off like fish in a barrel. Thankfully, the troops of the North had reinforcements that counterattacked the preoccupied Southerners, but the casualties spoke for themselves. Almost 3,800 Union soldiers were killed, captured, or otherwise, compared to the 1,500 on the Confederate side. General Ulysses Grant called it one of the most depressing events in the war. Too right.
Yeah, the crater was a disaster. One of the reasons it was a disaster was because, and I won't know was it Ferrero? Anyway, there were groups of regiments. There were regiments that were prepared to fight. I think it had to do with whether the colored regiments, as they were called, whether they would go in or whether they would use white troops. And it got switched out at the last minute. So after these Pennsylvania coal miners dug this long mine with tons and tons of blasting material, TNT, I believe, they blew it up, and soldiers, which weren't really all that understanding, I guess, of the plan, crawled out, and they were in the crater. And it was something like 20 minutes later, they were able to the Southerners were able to get reinforcements up there. But for a while they had a real good chance. The other part of it was that they couldn't climb out very well. The crater was very steep. And a final thought on this is that they did this so many times. There were something like 17 or 18 different craters or explosions like the crater that were getting ready to be detonated at at the siege of Vicksburg. But the siege ended, and they never had they obviously never went off. But World War I, same thing. They were always digging and blowing up areas of the line. It's just that this was it was an embarrassing disaster. It was Ambrose Burnside was a great proponent of it. I believe it was his idea to run up the chain of command, and they were just kind of sitting there at the siege of Petersburg. And it's sort of like when I look back on some of the things that I did in college, and my answer would have been, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So there you go.
Sometimes it's best to put on a brave face when the odds are unanimously against you. Corporal Thomas Galloway of the Federal Army did just that, and not only did he survive the encounter, he also captured 50 enemy troops. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Galloway was bruised and battered and limped his way to the retreating enemy. Despite being a very vulnerable target, he rounded up 50 enemy soldiers and took them back to base to become prisoners of war. Astonishingly, Galloway was only 15 years old.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's news to me, and I think I listened to the Gettysburg podcast. I've listened to it all the way through twice now, and I don't recall that one. So I'll freely admit that one of my favorite battles. I live 2 hours away from it. I did not know that. That is very interesting. Galloway, okay.
One of the strangest mysteries to have taken place in the American Civil War was during the Battle of Shiloh. As the injured lied in the fields en masse, their wounds started to glow in the dark and, later, healed considerably faster than everyone else's. Soldiers called this freaky sight Angel's Glow. This phenomenon was debunked in 2002 by William Martin and Jonathan Curtio, two teenagers researching ideas for their science school project. They discovered it was caused by a bacteria called photohaebdus luminescens. Body heat would have normally killed it, but since the battle took place on a cool day, the microorganisms landed on the wounds and ended up devouring the bad bacteria. Those healed by the Angel's Glow caught hypothermia instead. Bit of a double-edged sword, but it must have been quite a mesmerizing sight at the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The Battle of Shiloh was, my gosh, there's so many interesting things that happened at the Battle of Shiloh, but I was reminded of this listening to the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast, and yeah, that bacteria was a real thing. It's an oddity, but it was in that area. Yeah.
Contrary to what you've likely been taught in school, the Civil War did not decisively end after the famous Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. In actuality, the Confederate surrender was a rather messy and slow affair, as Confederate President Jefferson Davis wasn't captured until a month after General Lee and the Army of Virginia surrendered. Ironically, the Confederates actually won the last battle of the Civil War, which took place near Brownsville, Texas, even after most of the states and armies loyal to the Confederacy had already surrendered months prior. In fact, the last major Confederate force to surrender was an Indian one led by Cherokee Brigadier General Stand Watie. President Johnson actually formally declared the end of the American Civil War on August 20th, 1866. Unfortunately, due to his assassination, President Lincoln, who had pursued the war against the Confederacy for 4 grueling years, did not live to see the end of hostilities and the restoration of the Union.
Very true about General Stand Watie. It was the last, I think, major fighting force. You could say major, but not really major. To hold out. But yes, the Army of Northern Virginia, they did surrender first, but they surrendered the army. There were other armies. There was Joseph E. Johnson with the army of, gosh, what was left of the army of Tennessee and any other state that was left in the South. And that, I forget, there were maybe like 30,000, maybe. Maybe if you guys know the number, put it down below. And there was a debacle there. That was a couple weeks later, or a week later. He surrendered to Sherman, and then, the Mississippi River was cut, because of Vicksburg and Port Hudson. So then you've got what they called the Trans-Mississippi, which is essentially western Louisiana in a way, that area, the back area. Texas, parts of Oklahoma, which is what was called Indian Territory, Arkansas, and they held out till May. I mean, they were formally surrendered, I think, in May, and that would be Kirby Smith and Richard Taylor to take care of that. But the last ones to actually hold out was a place in, I believe, Indian Territory, and there was like I want to say, a company of a couple, maybe 50 men, and they had just been holding out, and they would make these, you know how the end of wars go. They're just sort of the last holdouts. They do little tiny hit and run things, and they're like, look, these people are just, we're trying to get back to our lives. These people are still out there, and eventually they become too much of a nuisance, and they take care of it. I believe that's the way it ended, but it's something along those lines. But it was unfortunate. Yes, Lincoln was not able to see the on paper end of the Civil War.
Those, then, are 10 facts you probably didn't know about the American Civil War. For more top lists just like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out our other top lists.
I couldn't have said it better myself. If you like this, even if you want to see other ones, please subscribe. Let me know if you did like it. Let me know, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about what you knew, what you didn't know, and what did I get wrong. That's always important to know too. And again, if we could do it constructively, that would be really cool. Talk to you guys next time. That sounds better, next time.